So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It is a real honor today to have Ms. Ahunna Eziakonwa with us to speak about coronavirus in Africa, response and building back stronger. So just really quickly, I'll give an introduction, and then I will turn it over, and we'll have time in about half an hour for Q&A. So just so you all know who you have the honor to hear from today, Ms. Ahunna Eziakonwa officially began her role as UNDP's Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa in August of 2018. In this role, she leads the UNDP's work supporting 46 countries in Africa to achieve Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Prior to taking up this post, Ms. Eziakonwa was the UN Resident Coordinator and the UNDP Resident Representative and UN Humanitarian Coordinator in Ethiopia, as well as the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Uganda, and before that she held the same position in Lesotho. She has also worked as Chief of the Africa Section for the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, where she managed over 15 country operations in Africa. Before joining the United Nations, Ms. Eziakonwa held a series of senior positions with civil society organizations in Africa. She holds a master's degree in international affairs with a focus on economic and political development from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And she is personally passionate about broadening the space for engaging youth and women in sustainable development. So we are really quite lucky to hear from her today about the UNDP's response in Africa. With that, I will turn it over just with a quick note that if you have a question to ask at any time, please do put it into the Q&A box. And if you are calling in, you can email Brian at bthang@network2020.org, and he can put that in the queue for you. And he'll also post all those instructions. So, Ahunna, over to you.
Thank you, Courtney, and thanks a lot for inviting me to this platform. And let me say a big hello to all the network members. It's a pleasure to spend this hour with all of you. I suppose most of you are in New York, so here's also wishing you well as we go through this crisis here. I have been, as you heard from Courtney, most of my work life has been on the continent of Africa, and I'm an African, grew up on the continent, went to school there for the most part. And I have to say that I've never actually, it's a continent that's been through a lot. Civil wars, other pandemics such as HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and poverty, and a lot of stress in the last decades. And I would say that actually it was only about a decade and a half ago that the tide started to turn for the continent. We've had these 2 decades of good news stories. And when I took on this position, I took it with very high spirits because I could see that indeed the story was changing on the continent. I think for the first time one felt that we could really talk about a continent of hope, which we could talk about a continent that is where you would have the future of development. We saw several African countries really speeding ahead in terms of their growth, double-digit numbers. We could see while the rest of the world was turning into nationalistic and protectionist tendencies, African countries were renewing Pan-Africanism. It's like, the rebirth of Pan-Africanism, and really linking up with each other. We saw integration of the continent coming through in real terms with the signing of the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Area, which is bringing all the countries of the continent together for Africa to trade with itself. We also saw several conflicts that had been raging on the continent going down. There was new violence in places like the Sahel and the Lake Chad regions. But for the most part, Africa's big civil wars had ended. And we could see the emergence of a new generation as well. It's a very young continent. In most countries, young people make up 60 to 70% of the population. And I mean, from where I sat, I was really infused with the kind of creativity and innovation that was emerging from African youth, both in terms of the tech industry, but also the creative industries. I myself come from Nigeria, and we saw the emergence of Nollywood as a serious player, the collaboration with Hollywood as well. So Africa integrating within itself, but also with the world. And at the same time, one felt this sense of a continent that was now serious about taking care of its own development, about taking charge of its own destiny. You saw leaders emerging in Ethiopia, in Botswana, everywhere, where accountable leadership was starting to take center stage, even with all the challenges that still existed. So this is what's at stake, with the arrival of COVID-19, because even for myself leading the Africa Bureau in UNDP, last year we had our regional cluster meeting in Ghana, and the theme that we chose was Africa's Money for African Development, a future beyond aid. So you had countries already thinking of how they were going to wean themselves of sort of the aid culture, and really look into the resources that were African and that could transform the continent. So in terms of even the mentorships, they were starting to happen. And then COVID-19 happens, and one wonders where does that take the continent? Does it put a pause on all that optimism? Does it compel leaders to see the urgency of accelerating those development pathways even more? Because the alternative, it's a world where, pandemics such as coronavirus would not go away, because you would have economies that are just not strong enough, and institutions and structures not strong enough to overcome the impact of this. So, we're at a crossroads in the world, but also in Africa. Is this going to lead to a breakthrough in the way we govern economies and states, or is it going to send us to an ICU? So this is, I guess, the dilemma that one is facing right now. In terms of the impact of this on the continent itself, is devastating. I think it is at a level that none of us has ever seen before, from many dimensions. The first is that this is a continent that had pre-existing conditions. In other words, we still had countries recovering from conflict. We still had huge areas of the continent that are fragile and vulnerable to climate change and other conditions. Cyclone Idai had just hit less than a year ago, or just over a year ago, the Southern African countries, and they had not even recovered. We had a locust invasion in the Horn of Africa that was spreading into West Africa, not completely over that. We had an Ebola outbreak in DRC. Some people may not even remember this, had not been declared over yet. So, and of course, Africa still wrestles with lots of pockets of poverty. So all these pre-existing conditions means it's a continent that really can't afford this disease. And not that anyone can, but if it is as tough as it is for advanced countries, imagine what it would look like if 10 million Africans were to contract coronavirus, which is the estimate that WHO is currently given, should the containment and mitigation efforts not succeed. And so the second part is what really helps to stop this disease on its tracks: social distancing. It's exactly what it's difficult to achieve on the continent of Africa from two dimensions. One, it is an anomaly in the African essence, you know, in the sense that life on the continent is based on social connections. It's based on that physical closeness. But at the same time, because of poverty conditions, you have densely populated informal settlements that it's practically impossible to sort of, you know, put people apart and maintain that distance. At the same time, you know, life on the continent in terms of the economy, you have informality, informal economies. You have daily wage people. You have people who basically go out every day and make a living for that day, for themselves and their families. You cannot lock them down easily. Locking them down basically means killing their livelihood. So it's a killer disease. And the way to stop it is equally a killer for the continent in terms of the context of Africa. So what are the options is what many African governments are looking at today. How do we save lives while protecting livelihoods? And it is the biggest question on the table right now for every African leader, whether you are in South Africa, which is the epicenter for the continent with the highest numbers so far registered, or you are in Comoros, which has not registered one case, possibly because of lack of testing. But whether you are, wherever you are on the continent, whatever your numbers, you're wrestling with these questions because African countries know that it's only a matter of time if nothing is done for those numbers to escalate and overwhelm the health systems, which are extremely weak at this point. So the only option is really to stop this thing in its tracks. And the way to stop it means that you have a huge socioeconomic impact because livelihoods will be affected and are already being affected. We're seeing hunger rising. And the impact on Africa is also a result of the fact of the structure of the African economy. It's largely based on import-export dynamics. So Africa imports a lot of what it eats. And this is why we're currently worried about food, because already there was a food crisis in several places. So how will this affect food, the food situation? Oil constitutes for up to 40% of exports and the GDP of a lot of countries that have oil. Price has just crashed to negative. So what does this mean for those economies being able to sustain themselves and to use the resources they have to affect change in the situation? So recovery is going to look quite scary on the continent. At the same time, I would say the issues around debt and debt relief are coming up as well, because already there were quite a few countries that were facing debt distress. And now just the contemplation that they may have to take more debt to be able to get out of this crisis is something that people are really looking at as a severe consequence. And so there are calls for debt relief, there are calls for stimulus packages that could be provided to small and medium enterprises on the continent. It is a continent where you have maybe about 80% of women who work in the small and medium enterprises and informal sectors. So if they're hugely affected and they're also the caregivers, what happens? And we look at the impact of this on women, it's serious. Women are the ones who are there for the families. And now you have kids out of school. In East and Southern Africa alone, over 100 million kids have stopped going to school. And it's not going to look like what you and I experience here in New York or other places in the States, where your kids continue learning online, virtually. In most of these places, that's not an option. So we are, as a UN system, starting to look at e-learning as options for the continent, and e-learning strategies are being developed with companies, with private sector companies, IT companies that could support such efforts. So we're looking at a crisis with catastrophic consequences on a people, but also a crisis that reveals where we are failing as leaders, as development actors, shows the cracks in the models that we have been using to address needs in these countries. And one crack is that development models probably, or the way governance, global governance and national governance is approached, has not always put people at the center. So you're looking at an opportunity to create the people economy, to create economies that take into account these informal sectors, that take into account the small, medium enterprises, that take into account the young industrialists, that take into account the women, the small holders, farmers, for instance. We haven't paid enough attention to farmers in the past. And yet, these are people who feed the world and who will feed Africa when the crunch comes. So the rural economy becomes a very interesting center of focus in the post-COVID era. How do we ensure that, you know, this economy is brought to the mainstream and not just marginalized as and considered as something other? The whole concept of health and health systems as a public good, rather than as something that you put some resources in when you have something left from the financial and productive sectors. How do we ensure that health infrastructure becomes a priority? So the whole human capital development needs to be science, technology, and research. Africa needs to now understand the importance of industrializing, because most of what Africa needs to tackle this disease have to be imported from elsewhere. And with the supply chains broken, with the borders closing, with the ban on importations of critical, essential medical materials, it compromises Africa's ability to deal with this impact. So it's causing a self-reflection of not only African states, but also the private sector, to really think about how you activate local production. And we're seeing massive innovation in this area and incredible ingenuity. You see young people getting together and innovating through small makeshift labs, ideas on how to test your condition and determine whether you go to the hospital or not, based on an app that tells you, several symptoms that you're having. We're having innovations of, basically tailors coming up and saying they're now going to invest in sewing masks so that there are enough out there. We have in Ethiopia young people who are using 3D printing to create this shields for supermarkets and other places so that business can continue. Most African countries have gone the way of the lockdown and social distances, as I said earlier, cannot be sustained without having a severe impact on livelihoods. And so the race to come up with these materials that are needed to provide more protection for people, particularly the health workers, those on the front lines supporting the health system, becomes critical. So Africa is starting to repurpose. Hand sanitizers are now being produced by companies, industries like the beer industry, for instance, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of creativity, a lot of innovation, a lot of reflection and rethinking. It's like you need a new development software for the continent. And from a UNDP perspective, this is really where our interest is. How do we not waste this crisis? How do we utilize this opportunity that's being created to see exactly where the fault lines are? Opportunities created for everyone to feel concerned. This is one issue that concerns everyone. No one is left out. I mean, literally no one is left out. So it's not about the elite or the poor. It's about all of us. So how do we utilize this flattening, a leveling of the field to create a new momentum for the real kind of development that puts people at the center, that does not ignore the human capital development, that does not ignore the rural economy, that makes sure no one is left behind. You know, these kinds of questions are now being asked. And we are exploring this through looking at socioeconomic impact assessments and trying to analyze how countries can build back stronger. And we see this in about 4 dimensions. One, as I said, is making health a central focus of investments of countries. Health infrastructure, health systems, the software as well as the hardware. It cannot be ignored anymore. Second is ensuring that we're investing in the people. The people, the African people, are the best weapon to fight any disease, including this one. We saw that in the era of HIV/AIDS, struggling with that. It was those caregivers, those women, who really turned the tide. We saw that in the use of the artist, you know, the African artist, to get the messages out. So it's not a question of just for the state to handle, it's how you pull the people in to deal with this. So governance needs to change, and a governance that really has this inclusivity about it. And these are all the areas where we're working. And then building back greener. It's another opportunity that we see. One of the things that's been exposed in this crisis is that we can't fight it without access to energy. Energy on the continent of Africa is not just about the main grid. It's about renewable energy. This is actually where the opportunity is. And that's that green energy is going to bring a new economy that is good for people and planet. So how do we build back green? And how do we invest in local production and utilizing Africa's money for African development? You know, these are all the questions. And how do we govern better? You know, we are seeing the good leaders come out of this crisis. You see the strength and resilience and accountability of a leader by the way they're leading their country in a crisis situation. And we're seeing some good messages arising with the way some of the leaders are navigating this. If you take South Africa, you know, the South African president has rallied everyone, recognizing that this is not something that he's going to be able to do alone. So he built in communities, he built in people in the slums, he built in the private sector, he brings everybody and creates a coalition and creates a solidarity fund. We're seeing the African Union at the continental level say, the only way we can tackle this is through solidarity between African countries. So while at the beginning, everybody was like every country for themselves, now there is a rally together as a continent to say, we need a solidarity flight. And we saw this from the Ethiopian Prime Minister, again, showing incredible leadership to say, we need to create partnerships that will allow us to procure bulk materials that can come to Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian airlines can then distribute this to other countries. And practically, this is how countries are getting testing materials, masks, and the things that they need. So this idea of a new software, a new political idea is the opportunity that COVID-19 breeds. And that's what UNDP is investing in, where in all of the countries, practically all the countries in Africa, we have an offer on COVID response that includes helping countries to prepare for the surge, helping them to respond to the disease, and helping them to recover, to start charting the path for recovery, and using the entire UNDP international network for that, including sourcing best practices that then can inform the decisions that African countries make on which way they go, what options they follow, which is pretty difficult decision to make right now without any blueprints. So this is, generally what we're invested in. It is unprecedented times. It is clear that the rest of the world cannot succeed in fighting this battle if Africa does not succeed. So there is a global sort of enlightened self-interest, is what the Secretary General called it. That as we, try to address this, that we understand that there is a continent called Africa where there's a lot to lose in terms of the last decades of investment in development gains that could be lost overnight if this is not stemmed, and also in terms of the human toll that it will take. But if it's not sorted in Africa, it's not going to be sorted anywhere else. And that's the narrative that we're advancing from the UN side. And I think I want to end with this thought, which is, this continent is quite resilient. It has a lot of resilient people. The answers can come from the African people themselves. And everything that we do as an international community, as a development agency, must be focused on making sure that people are included in those models that we're deploying, in those stimulus packages that we're putting together, that they are going to the people and bringing them as part of the solution. If there's no trust between state and society, you can't overcome this. And already we have fragility in terms of the social contract between state and society. So our investment, our interventions are also designed to strengthen and reinforce that a strong social contract. Because if your people don't trust you, there's nothing that you say that they will follow. So we're trying to build in that trust in the response as well, to make sure the social contract is strong and firm. So everything we do should not undermine that social contract. It should rather reinforce it, because it's crucial for success to be achieved. So Courtney, let me stop there. I know it's already been half an hour, and maybe in the question and answers, I can bring in some more.
Terrific. Ahunna, thank you so much. You just did an incredible job, I think, laying out just the range of possibilities, which I think is really quite breathtaking, from the most potentially devastating impact to some of the real opportunities there are. As people start to put questions in the Q&A, and I encourage you all to start putting some questions into the Q&A box, I'll just kick it off with a question of my own. And I'd like to just follow up on some of the messages of hope and potential that you mentioned. So Network 2020, we do a lot of work in other parts of the world, and we do some work in Southeast Europe, and we're looking at entrepreneurship there. And some of my understanding from the work that we've done is that there are a lot of different reasons why innovation may or may not flourish. And sometimes it's, the education system is lagging behind. Sometimes it has to do with government. Sometimes it has to do with lack of capital or mindset among people. If there are there certain, and I realize that it's hard to answer this for the continent as a whole, but if you're looking across the continent, what are some of the challenges that you, in your role, would like to see overcome in order to really let some of that innovation and creativity that you mentioned flourish?
No, it's a very, very good question, Courtney. I think the first one, as I said, is, the innovation it's almost innate. I've worked in Africa all these years, and every time I meet these young people, educated and uneducated. It's incredible, the creativity that almost feels like it's in them. especially the younger generation. I met three young boys from Ethiopia, and they were in a really remote part of the country going to school. They were 17 years old, and they were already building robots out of cardboard. They had nothing, and they were out of nothing creating so much innovation. And it was like, wow, what would happen if you gave them just a little bit? And that little bit could be power, just power and connectivity, internet infrastructure being rolled out all over the continent, and in a serious way. Sometimes that just causes magic to happen. And you can't have internet without energy. So the two sort of go hand in hand. And for me, these are basic that need to be in there for the innovations to flourish even more. Of course, education. You have to be able to have at least a basic education levels to leverage the possibility of innovation. So, as I said, continuing this fight for e-education, it's so important, even in lockdown situations. So these young people are not left out, and there's no pause on their learning as a result of this crisis. None of us know how long this is going to go on for. So even in the interim, we have to make sure we facilitate the continuous learning of the young people. I'll just name these three. I think we need to continue with rolling out internet infrastructure and making sure that energy access is more widespread than it is currently.
All right, terrific. Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. And the questions are coming in, so I will turn to the Q&A box. And so the first question is, you bring a background of experience with the NGO sector in Africa. What is their role in ensuring the people's economy, the social contract, and government accountability to the people?
Massive. This is, it's a triangle, right? You've got the states there, then you have the civil society, and then you have the society at large. And I think the civil society continues to have a central role, actually, because for the most part, they're very close to the people. Governments try, but even with all the efforts in the world, you still have a distance, and you still have trust issues, and you still have big areas that are not fully governed, where state authority is not completely extended. And you find NGOs. You find not that they play the role of the state, but they play an important role of building trust with the people, with the communities. And so when a government needs another voice to convince people of what the imperatives are in overcoming some of these challenges, the NGOs could play a very important role. I never advocate for NGOs to play the role of states or to displace that. It's important that you maintain that social contract between state and society, and NGOs can facilitate that, not replace it. Do you understand my reasoning there? It's, we have the temptation sometimes where, especially where states are weak, to fill that in, to fill in the gap with civil society work. And that sort of drives further apart the state and the people. It does create it widens the distance. And so I'm always searching for how can NGOs, non-state actors, play their role in such a way that they reinforce, not undermine, the relationship between those who govern and those who are governed. Because in times of crisis like this, that relationship needs to be solid. Because imagine that where we will lose this battle will be in places where people are so far away from their governments and don't trust them. So you speak, you give all the instructions, but nobody believes you. Instead, they believe their government is against them. So whatever government says, we don't have to listen, or we do the opposite, So I see really NGOs could play an incredible role there in first getting services to people, bringing the people's needs to the states, making sure that there's an understanding of what the needs are on the ground because they're so close on the ground, making sure that there's accountability in the spending of development resources. This is crucial because one of the things that will happen in response to this crisis is that there will be a lot of money thrown at the situation, wherever that money comes from. It will be needed. It's not to underestimate the importance of cash in recovering from this, but it needs to go to where it's needed. It cannot be captured by a few. And I think NGOs can play an important role in ensuring that there's integrity in the system of delivery and distribution.
Oh, it's a terrific point, and they can help us keep that trust between the government and the people. I think that's a really critical point. Thank you for making that. So our next question is, coronavirus is expected to put millions of people back into poverty. What will African countries and the international community have to do differently from previous anti-poverty campaigns to solve this problem after coronavirus subsides?
Yeah, well, I can tell you what we're doing at UNDP. The UNDP administrator launched an offer, a COVID-19 offer. UNDP is a development agency, so this question really cuts to the core of what we do, which is looking at the socio-economic impact of this on countries. So there is the health impact, which is taken care of by WHO and others who work in the health. So the whole dynamics, but the impact on livelihoods and the economy, it's going to be the one that lives the longest with the people. So how do we first understand this? So in every country where we are supporting governments to do an impact assessment so that they have the evidence that they need to inform how they're going to navigate a recovery pathway. So that's one. It's really understanding the impact, particularly the impact on the vulnerable. The populations that are often left behind, that are marginalized. Understanding how it affects women as opposed to how it affects men. So the gender dimensions and disaggregation is important. Understanding how it affects young people, youth, and so on and so forth. So that impact assessment is one offer that we're making, because unless you really have it, unless you have the evidence, it's difficult to target properly. And then the second aspect that we're looking at is how to access resources for countries. The financials are going to be important, making sure that the fiscal stress that countries will have as a result of this is somehow accommodated in some of the schemes that are out there. So global funds that would be put together, how can African positioning them to be able to access those funds, but also looking at innovative funding. We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are yet to be achieved. We're looking at this as a decade of action, looking at how we can build global coalitions for the Sustainable Development Goals, for keeping them on track to 2030. And that could help us really direct countries to where they could access some of those resources. The administrator from the UNDP side already working with others on the debt relief issue and debt moratorium. You cannot pile up debts on countries at this stage. There has to be some schemes that are put in place to give them a little bit of fiscal room to respond to this. We are specializing particularly looking at small and medium enterprises, which are the biggest job creators on the continent, developing financial packages, rescue packages for them. First of all, for them to stay in business and to be able to bounce back very quickly. So working with financial institutions, the World Bank, the IFC, and others, to see if we can really put together these packages. So one of the things we're doing is identifying the SMEs that will help boost a return of the economy as a result. Food is going to be an issue, as I said earlier, and we are now starting to work with the agencies concerned to look at the socio-economic dimensions of the food crisis and how to overcome that. So these are some of the ideas. The African Union has put out a number out there, 150 billion that it will require. The Secretary General of the UN has a socio-economic framework now that is looking at how to, again, draw the world's attention to the most vulnerable countries that will be affected and put resources. So there's a multi-donor trust fund that is being managed out of the Secretary General's office that will help bring resources to bear where they most matter in the aftermath of this.
All right, terrific, thank you. Turning to our next question is, the next question is about the global competition for resources such as PPE, ventilators in the wake of COVID-19. And how does Africa play into this, and what is the UN's role in helping Africa get what it needs?
Can you just repeat that again? It went too quickly.
So it's a question about access to PPE and ventilators, and what is the UN's role in helping countries in Africa get some of the equipment that they need?
So we are procuring at different levels. Several agencies, not just UNDP, are doing this, WHO also, for Africa. And as I said earlier, the leadership of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia was really critical in ensuring, because it's one thing to have the materials, it's another thing to get them from A to B. And with the logistics situation right now, with the closure of borders and everything, it made it even that more difficult for African countries to access these materials. So first problem was solved with that leadership taken by the Ethiopian Prime Minister to say, we will avail flights to take things from one location into other countries. So this solidarity flight that they have established with the African Union. The second is we are doing in UNDP Africa, we're actually doing a bulk procurement through our China office. A lot of these materials are more available in China than anywhere else so far. And the critical needs, PPEs, but test kits and ventilators and all of that, we're starting to procure and to deliver to some of the countries. We already had 2 deliveries in Nigeria and Cameroon, and now others are coming up. But we're among a few others who are procuring this. And the third dimension is the local production that I mentioned. We are finding that actually there's a lot of capacity on the continent to produce some of the things, maybe not ventilators tomorrow, but hand sanitizers, masks, the protective gears themselves, shields, and these are already ongoing in several countries, South Africa and other countries, and they are actually being delivered by startups, youth startups. And so one of the things that we've decided to do is to get attention to these centers of production in terms of financial injection of resources to enable them to produce even more. Because imagine, this is a win-win. The impact of this is job losses. But if you create opportunities and an enabling environment, put in place the right regulatory framework and fast-track kind of crisis modulated rules and regulations and remove bottlenecks, you could actually see jobs being recreated and repurposed for this population.
Excellent. So our next question actually can dovetail on that a little bit, and then what I'll start doing is I'll start grouping some of the questions because we have a lot. So the next question is, what can be done to ensure that foreign investors extract, refine, and make end products in countries in Africa where raw materials are found?
Oh, this is, I mean, again, I would say this crisis creates opportunity for that. And, you know, we heard earlier in the month, for instance, a company in Senegal that company was used to produce Ebola test kits. And it repurposed to start producing COVID-19 testing kits, and a company, and the UK is working with this company, because once this is produced, it's going to actually be better quality, it's going to be quicker, it's going to, you know, it's going to be cheaper, you know. So there is a lot of opportunity now to partner with foreign companies where the raw materials exist, but also the interest and capacity exist. You know, we heard, for instance, of the possibility of doing this digital diagnostic kits, where we're not only, I mean, remember, we're trying to see how what is left after this crisis benefits the future, right? So what we learn now should go beyond addressing COVID-19. So imagine if this sort of diagnostic digital kits in a box can be manufactured, and they're being manufactured in some places, but connect with a country in Africa, with a company in Africa where this could be manufactured on scale, and then used for the future. Because it is a continent that has to deal with a lot of infectious diseases, right? So I think the other opportunities is with the youth industrialists, you know, through the startups, the tech companies, because the digital economy has become so important in this fight. Even when we address the issue on the recovery stage, where you will need cash transfers and things like this to get people to bounce back, you're going to need to work with digital money. You know, you're going to need mobile money, and already in Africa we have a huge penetration of this. And then how do the fintech companies come together to take some of this to scale? It's so I see nothing but opportunity in terms of foreign investors going in and working with these local producers to take things to scale.
All right, terrific. All right, so the next round of questions, I'm going to group a few of them, just in the interest of trying to get through as many as possible. So there are quite a few questions that are interested in education and the e-learning platform, and let me see if I can group some of these a little bit elegantly. So there are questioners who want to learn about how to address e-learning platforms and how to make that available. And you alluded to this earlier when you talked about power and energy, but with the high cost of data, degrading quality and size of data, bandwidth, and regular power outages, and how do you make that available when particularly in rural communities? And on the other end of that is how do you see a prototype training organized for young leaders interested in learning and spreading the idea of new software for development? And so I guess that's a little bit different, but looking at unleashing the idea of education online.
Yeah, you know, I'm a former teacher, so this is an area that I'm very passionate about. I really think the opportunity is massive here. Yes, we have limitations and challenges in sort of just internet availability, just the infrastructure. Not everyone is connected. So that creates a limit to how much you can use sort of online learning. But it's possible in some cases. But where you don't have that, we're also, you're seeing very interesting ideas coming up from UNESCO and UNICEF, who are leading on this, on tele-learning. So creating opportunities for groups to come And even if you don't have a television in your house, to have a center where you could bring a number of kids and the teaching goes on through the airwaves and you're learning through the television. Radio is another one that's been mentioned, that, in almost every village you have, people with radio. Where they don't have television, they would have radio. How do you also create curriculum and teaching models that can pass through radio? But with regards to the IT part, where it is possible, I think what we're finding, and this is really fascinating, about 15 companies, IT companies, have signed up to work with the UN on this e-strategy and give freely some access to the enablers that are needed within the IT sense ecosystem. So from MTN to Microsoft to, they're all signing up to work on this. So the possibilities are huge. And then, of course, you can set up virtual academies for teachers, because it's not just about the kids learning, it's also about teaching the teachers how to operate in this new environment. And what I see, for those who ask this question, what I see again is a beyond COVID-19 dividend, in the sense that suddenly you could have a group of kids in a place called Karamoja in Uganda, which is very remote, where you cannot get good teachers to go out there to teach, because the conditions are just so poor and bad and inconvenient that nobody wants to go there. So the kids there are condemned to the poorest quality of education going through to them. But if we were to succeed in e-learning, e-education, those kids could have first-class teachers in math reaching them and basically transforming their world as a result. So for me, again, I see huge benefits in this area and huge possibilities. But it takes partnership. It takes all those who are in the value chain coming together and saying, we're going to work in an integrated manner to make this happen.
All right, thank you. Okay, we're bumping up against the clock, unfortunately, and we have so many questions left. So I'll try to go through and see if I can group a couple of them. So one wants to know whether you think that international organizations such as the World Bank and G20 debt relief, do they represent enough financial support for Africa? And then I'll throw a couple of governance ones at you as well. There are a couple of people that want to know, one person wants to know about how elections might be affected and whether or not it's possible, I think, within the UN system to organize general meetings to rethink individual policies that show the importance of leaving no one behind. So that's a lot of governance and economics. So no. take your pick and we'll see what we get through.
And I'll try to be short so you can catch up on time. On the governance one, we are really preoccupied with this elections calendar, which is now disrupted across the continent. We had more than, I think, 15 to 20 countries that were scheduled for elections in between now and next year. And with everything to do with election, you have to prepare. So it's not just the election date, it's the whole process that goes on before elections, voter registration, voter education, all of that, it's now off schedule. At the same time, countries' constitutions don't have any provision for a COVID-type disruption. So quite a few countries might find themselves in a constitutional crisis where they're not able to determine. And then the trust issue comes in. And we're already seeing that conversation where it's like, being between a rock and a hard place, because some countries have gone forward with elections in the crisis. And the result has been, well, why did you do that? Because look, the turnout is so low and opposition leaders didn't have time to prepare themselves. And then some have actually tried to postpone the elections. And at the same time, there's a concern. Are you now using COVID-19 to put a pause on democratization, you know? So it's a very difficult dilemma that African countries are facing now. And we are actually trying to analyze this to see what is the compromise, you know, and how do countries learn to speak with their population so that, again, that trust issue is there and it's not all about conspiracy. Because we actually believe in the middle of this crisis, it's very difficult to conduct elections. And if you're going to do it, you have to invest a lot in the logistics. And we don't see much accommodation for that. But the whole impact on governance is a big one. It actually either is going to help us improve democratization or it will delay the consolidation of democratization on the continent, because there could be also opportunistic players who tried to use the crisis to postpone things. And the other aspect of that is justice. And we are finding, of course, justice system, judiciary, you know, is affected. So, you know, they're not processing cases as fast as they could. So you have people stuck in prison whose cases have not been heard. And how do we, again, unleash e-justice possibilities for these countries to be able to give better access to justice is a governance issue. On the money, it's difficult to say how much money is enough. I mean, I think everything is underestimated right now. Even the 150 billion out of the AU it's an underestimate because that came earlier, and now we know how deep the impact of this crisis is going to be on economies. We are seeing that there will be much more that is needed in the scheme of things. But what's more important for me, as I said earlier, is that however much is mobilized, that it goes really into addressing the real issues, that there are good accountability and transparency systems. It could make leaders, you know, the way these resources are used, because the best leaders who would earn the trust of their populations will be the ones who invest whatever monies they get effectively and efficiently. But it's too early to tell whether it's going to be 100 billion or 500 billion, but we certainly hope that the envelope will be sufficient for a bounce back.
Absolutely. So we bounced up against time, unfortunately, because we have so many really great questions in the queue, and my apologies to everyone who asked a question that we didn't get to. Ahunna, it looks like we'll have to have you back at some point if you're willing to come, just because there are so many terrific questions. And thank you so much for, I think, doing, you know, the work that you do, first of all, and then two, doing such a terrific job at laying out, I think, just the spectrum of possibilities and how, yes, it is a terrible crisis, but that within this, there are, you know, some real opportunities for leadership, for networks to build back better, as you're saying. And I really do hope that that's what we see. I really thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I thank everyone who joined us on the call. We do have our next briefing is on Thursday at noon, and it's on the COVID-19's impact on entrepreneurship worldwide. And so we have Elmira Bayrasli and Bouquet Juhadar, who will be joining us from Foreign Policy Interrupted and the Global Entrepreneurship Network to talk about the impact on entrepreneurship. We will be hopefully being able to post this to YouTube. So for those of you who would like to see it again, we can do that. And Ahunna, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Courtney, for inviting me. And sorry, everyone, that I couldn't get up to all the questions, but do send us the rest of the questions and maybe we'll find a way to.
We will. We'll do that, absolutely. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.